I guess. No, at 30 we need to say something. And then give another 2 minutes. How many are we at? 12. You know, people to join beforehand. They just don't see the screen. Or at least. Yeah, they can start 5 minutes before, right? Just keep it on. Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome all of you to our 4th training session on public-private partnership. We're just giving everyone a minute or two to join in. We can see people are logging in as I speak right now. So the plan is for us to start in the next minute or two. Yeah, I think just give us a couple of minutes and we should start this presentation for today. Thanks. Great, thanks everyone for joining this session. I believe we are now in session 4 of the Anjawala and Khanna training on public-private partnerships. Thank you all for joining the live session. In this particular session, we are going to focus on construction contracts and what we call O&M contracts, operation and maintenance contracts. These contracts are obviously a key feature of the overall matrix of contracts in a public-private partnership project, and therefore understanding how these contracts work and how they fit into the overall project and how they fit into the overall role of contracts within a project is fundamental and critical to be able to properly structure a bankable infrastructure project. So what we are going to focus on today in relation to construction contracts and O&M is, firstly, what are the roles of these contracts within the overall project scheme? What are the elements of each of these contracts? And most importantly, how do you allocate risk within these 2 contracts, taking into account the risks you are taking in relation to your other contracts, whether it is the offtake agreement, whether it is the financing agreements? How do you now start allocating risks that you have taken on under contracts like the offtake and the financing agreements and how do you deal with that under the construction contracts and the operation and maintenance contracts. So that is the focus of the discussion today. If you are a sponsor of a project and you're asking yourself about how do I structure my construction contract, taking into account the rest of my contracts in relation to my offtake and my financing agreements, there are a couple of key questions you probably need to ask yourself before you think about settling down on a particular contract structure. The first point you need to take into consideration is what is the degree of control I, as a project sponsor, want to have in relation to the construction and operation of this project. The second issue you need to consider is where is your money coming from and what are the expectations of your financiers in relation to your construction contract. So, for example, in relation to the issue of degree of control, on one extreme end, you as a project sponsor can actually undertake construction and operations of the project because it would be your view that you have the necessary expertise and experience to be able to undertake this. This is not uncommon where you have contractors and operators playing the role of sponsors in the project. But going back to my second issue about lender considerations, many lenders would be concerned about the sponsor undertaking the role of the contractor and the operator because of the potential for conflicts of interest between these three roles. So again, factoring in where your money is coming from and what the expectations of your financing parties are vis-a-vis the level of control you would like to have in relation to construction and operation is extremely important. The other issue as a sponsor you need to think about when you're deciding on a principal structure, especially in relation to the construction contract, is how complicated is this project? How uncertain are the costs in relation to this project? And therefore, what is my ability to fix time and cost in relation to this project? The more complex the project, the more uncertain the project, the more difficult it is to be able to fix time and cost in relation to your construction and operational issues. So having dealt with the fundamental principles around thinking about how you consider structuring a construction contract, what type of construction contracts do you want to use? For purposes of this discussion today, the idea is to focus on one of the more common construction contracts that is used in the market. And this is what we call an EPC contract, an engineering procurement construction contract. The reason a contract of this nature is viewed favorably by sponsors and lenders is because it has certain elements in this contract whereby risk can be allocated and taken away from the sponsor and pushed to the contractor and the operator. So the key principles of an EPC contract that allows you to move risk from the sponsor to the contractor is that, firstly, you have what we call a single point of responsibility. As you can imagine, an overall construction arrangement has a number of elements to it. You need to design whatever you are building. You then need to have a logistics and transport element to it. There is a supply element of bringing in goods and materials. And then there is the whole building and installation of whatever infrastructure you're putting together. What an EPC contract does is effectively to wrap all these different elements and provide what we call a single point of responsibility. In other words, what it does is it makes one contractor, the EPC contractor, the single point of responsibility for all these entire different elements that ultimately results in a built product for you as a sponsor. The other two key elements that you should find in an EPC contract is that largely the price and the time will be fixed. In other words, you pass on a significant responsibility and risk to the contractor to build within a fixed period of time and to build within a fixed cost. And as you can imagine, these three elements would be looked at most favorably by lenders and sponsors. However, it is important as a sponsor for you to understand the tension between pricing and passing on risk to the contractor, because what always happens is that the more risk you pass to the contractor, frankly, the more expensive the project will be, the more expensive your construction cost is. And that balance between risk and price is one of the key issues that sponsors and lenders need to consider in terms of finding the appropriate balance. In addition to having a single EPC contract, we are also seeing the possibility of having multiple EPC contracts that are then wrapped over what we call an EPCM structure, whereby a manager is appointed to coordinate and oversee the different EPC contracts to try and ensure that you can get a number of the efficiencies that you could have got under a single EPC contract, but potentially with the possibility of saving on costs. What this generally means, however, is that the sponsor also, together with the manager, will have a greater role in coordinating the different contractors to make sure that your fundamental principles of trying to fix cost and trying to fix time is still possible, despite the fact that you're using multiple contractors. As with every single contract in a PPP structure, understanding risk and understanding how you mitigate risk is fundamental. As you can imagine, in a construction contract, there are numerous risks that need to be considered by a sponsor, and how they deal with these risks vis-a-vis the contractor and other third parties. You will have risk in relation to design, coordination, procurement, site risk, logistics, regulatory risk, and all these risks need to be considered. And based on how you deal with these risks, you then need to figure out what kind of provisions do I need in my construction contract. Your construction contract is typically going to have a fair amount of detail on various types of issues, which ultimately go towards this fundamental question around how do I allocate risk on those key issues. So if you look at what the key issues are when you are putting together a construction contract, what the role of the contractor is vis-a-vis the role of the employer is obviously fundamental. And this goes down to specifically the issue of risk allocation. Is it the contractor or is it the employer that will develop the design of the project? It is not unusual, for example, for the design to be initially developed by the sponsors and then passed on to the contractor. The problem with that type of arrangement is the contractor in turn is going to say, if there is an error or a flaw in the design, then I, the contractor, cannot be responsible for the ultimate end product. You can imagine that a conversation of that nature would make many lenders deeply nervous and concerned. And so what you find typically is that a practical solution is reached whereby the sponsor takes his designs and asks the contractor to review them. He then asks the contractor to take full responsibility in relation to the design, so that what we call the blame game in construction contracts, we do not have that issue if down the line the end product doesn't work because there was an issue with the design. Obviously, a conversation like this with the contractor is going to result in increased cost to your construction contract. But in many cases, these will be requirements of lenders to ensure that you have a bankable project. Site risk is another clear area where a conversation will be had around who takes risk in relation to soil conditions, access to site, topography, and all these other issues, especially where the land is owned or controlled by the sponsor. Again, these are issues that require conversations with the contractor. And on each of these issues, as you pass along risk to the contractor, you should frankly expect the construction price to increase. Whilst we will not be able to have the time to be able to go through each of these elements, we will try and go through some of these elements to give you a flavor of some of the issues you need to consider. Pricing and payment structures are obviously going to be one of the key areas of commercial discussion between a sponsor and a contractor. On the pricing issue, there are a number of ways to structure your contract. You can have, in a typical EPC structure, a single fixed price lump sum contract price. However, it is not unusual for employers to shy away from that structure, is because typically a price structure of that nature is going to mean a higher contract price. So for infrastructure projects that are financed on a non-recourse basis, fixed lump sum price contracts are fairly normal. On the other hand, we find more traditional real estate projects, even those of a very large value, tend to shy away from the pure fixed price contract and tend to favor a unit price structure. What do I mean by a unit price structure? Under such a contract, the contractor agrees to fix the prices of all his inputs: labor, goods, and service. What, however, he doesn't fix is the quantities that are required. So, for example, under such an arrangement, the contractor will agree to fix the price of steel or the price of cement. But what he will not fix is the quantities that are required. And so, as an employer, you take a risk on the quantities that would be required for the project. What you are then doing is relying on the fact that your quantity surveyor has prepared a bills of quantities that is in fact accurate, so that you ultimately end up with a final price that matched what you originally envisaged. But in this particular structure, as I said earlier, the contractor refuses to take the risk in relation to how much quantity of material will be used. These structures are fairly common in large-scale real estate projects in East Africa. So understanding the risk around how you deal with the unit price arrangement is extremely important. You can also have a cost plus structure. In this type of arrangement, you agree with the contractor on what his actual costs are, and then you agree to provide a margin over and above the cost. In this part of the world, these type of pricing mechanisms are fairly unusual because most of the times employers do not have a good handle on what the actual costs are of the contractor. Secondly, and I believe this is the correct view, is that a structure of this nature does not incentivize the contractor to maintain costs at an appropriate level, because frankly, the higher the costs, the greater the margins. So whilst a structure like this is possible for certain types of infrastructure, they are very rarely used in this part of the world. The other thing that needs a clear focus and understanding of in relation to EPC contracts is time and cost. What are the provisions you need to think about in relation to time and cost? As I said earlier, the fundamental principle of an EPC contract is to fix time and to fix costs. But frankly, that is easier said than done, because you are going to have fairly detailed discussions and negotiations with the contractor around those circumstances around which time and cost could change, where the contractor will say, upon the occurrence of the following events, I am expecting my cost to change I am expecting my time to change, and I am further expecting no penalties being levied on me for these events. What these events are and how you structure them within the contract is probably one of the key areas of specialism that is required to put together a bankable project. So as a matter of principle, how do you try and fix time in relation to an EPC contract? What you do is you create a structure in the contract whereby you set a starting time for the project to commence, and you set an end date, an anticipated end date, when you expect the project to complete. If that date is not achieved, you then have a second structure below that, whereby you are entitled to levy what we call delay liquidated damages. For each day or each month, there is a delay in getting to the time you expected or anticipated to get to. These liquidated damages are what creates the incentive for the contractor to complete within time. From a legal perspective, it's extremely important to understand what your jurisdiction allows in relation to delay liquidated damages. In many common law jurisdictions, a liquidated damages structure that is structured on the basis of a penalty could be deemed to be unenforceable. And therefore, it's extremely important that in those jurisdictions, you ensure that your provisions are in fact legally enforceable. Next slide. Whilst you agree with these key principles in relation to what the time expectations are, what the liquidated damages are, the contractor will seek to negotiate what the carve-outs are to changes in time, whereby he is not penalized for that. Typically, a contractor will insist that events such as force majeure, political events, variations are negotiated as carve-outs to the principle of time. The other issue that you will need to consider and negotiate with your contractor is in relation to payment. Obviously, when the contractor receives his money is fundamental to the contractor. And once again, there are a number of payment structures you can consider for your EPC contract. So whilst you can have a fixed lump sum price contract, when you pay, when you make those payments must also be agreed. In an ideal world, you would like to tell the contractor, please start all the work, complete the work, and I will pay you the entire amount at the end of the completion of the project. Most of the times, such a structure will not be acceptable to a contractor, and therefore you need to agree on when during the construction period payments are made. It is not unusual for an initial advance payment to be made right at the commencement of the contract. This advance payment allows the contractor to mobilize, get on site, start making orders with suppliers. But remember, at the point in time you're making an advance payment, you have seen no tangible work from the contractor. And therefore, we would recommend that against any advance payment made by the contractor at the beginning of the contractor, you as a sponsor or employer receive in return an advance payment guarantee, so that if, frankly, your contractor takes your advance payment and then disappears or suddenly becomes insolvent, you have the ability to claim back your advance payment by calling on the advance payment guarantee. So that is typically the first payment issue you will need to deal with the contractor. Then the next issue you will have to deal with is, how do you structure the interim payments? Typically, a contractor would require periodic payments made to him, for example, monthly or quarterly payments. And typically, a contractor would want those payments pegged to the amount of work he has done. If you're an employer, one of the concerns with such a structure is that it doesn't create necessarily the right incentive for the employer to complete on time. Because what can happen is the employer can do some basic work, meet his costs by getting a basic payment from you, and push out his work program by doing that repeatedly. So a possible structure to counter that kind of arrangement is to have what we call a milestone payment structure. Under this, you will set out very clear milestones in your construction contract. And only upon completion of each milestone do you make a payment. The advantage with this is it incentivizes a contractor to complete a milestone, because no partial payments are made, unlike the periodic payment structure. You will then have to focus on payments that are made on completion. You would obviously expect a contractor to demand the full balance of the payment on completion. However, as an employer, you should note that you can, as part of a security structure, retain some money, a percentage of the total contract price, retain some money as security to deal with any warranty or defect issues you may have after the completion of the projects. So it is not necessary for you to pay the entire contract price on completion if you have what we call a retention structure built into the construction contract. However, this will be part of an overall discussion with the contractor about what security package the contractor is putting forward to guarantee his obligations. In addition to time and cost, the other key factor for an employer to consider is, how do I ensure that I actually get the right product? You know, it's great if my contractor bills on time and bills within cost, but what if it doesn't work? So quality or performance guarantees are also fundamental in structuring your construction contracts. And depending on the nature of the project, there are many ways to structure performance guarantees. But in principle, what you do is you set out your performance parameters. And based on those performance parameters, you then structure appropriate, what we call performance liquidated damages, if there is a failure to meet those very specific performance parameters. Once again, just like delay liquidated damages, in many common law jurisdictions, if these damages are viewed as penalties, they are potentially unenforceable. And therefore, it's fundamental that depending on the applicable law of your jurisdiction, they are structured in a manner that makes them legally enforceable. As I said, how you structure your performance guarantees can vary from project to project. What you can also typically have within a performance liquidated damages structure is setting out what your minimum performance guarantees are likely to be and what your optimum performance guarantees are likely to be. So for example, if you are building a power plant, you may say, my minimum performance guarantee is 90% output. And the reason you would likely say that is under your offtake or power purchase agreement, the government has demanded a minimum performance guarantee. In that case, you will have a minimum performance guarantee structure in your construction contract. And if the contractor fails to meet a minimum performance guarantee, you have the ability to what we call reject the works. This is a remedy available under contract where you are allowed to say, we do not accept the works, we reject the works because you have failed to meet the minimum performance guarantee. Because the failure to meet the minimum performance guarantee will most likely mean that the government is going to be rejecting your infrastructure and not making payment to you. And therefore, as part of structuring your minimum performance guarantees, you must structure your rejection provisions that work hand in hand with the failure to meet minimum performance guarantees. You can then have a liquidated damages structure whereby, whilst the contractor has met minimum guarantees, he has not delivered optimum guarantees. What this is likely to mean under your offtake and your financing agreements is, whilst you'll be allowed to operate the plant, you will be generating revenue, you will not be generating the revenue, the maximum revenue you had envisaged under your financial model. And therefore, if there is a failure by the contractor to meet the optimum performance guarantees, you would then seek to charge performance liquidated damages to make up that shortfall of revenue that you're likely to suffer as a result of not meeting the optimum guarantee requirements. With that, I would like to move on to discuss operation and maintenance contracts. As I said, construction contracts involve numerous risks. They involve numerous provisions, but unfortunately, with the time restrictions we have, it's difficult to discuss each one of those in detail. And so I thought focusing on the fundamental issues around time and cost and risks associated around that would hopefully be useful for all of you. Operation and maintenance contracts typically become relevant at the time the construction project is completed and you are now required to operate the infrastructure that has just been built. Your offtake agreements will most likely have very stringent operating criteria. It will require you to meet performance guarantees during the operation of the plant. It will require you to comply with law. It will require you to comply with environmental standards. It will require you, towards the end of the project, potentially to hand over the infrastructure back to the government in a certain condition. And therefore, taking into account your obligations under the offtake agreement, and then further taking into account your obligations under the financing agreements, where you are required to pay your financiers. And obviously, if your infrastructure, whilst it may have been built perfectly, if not operated properly, will not generate the revenues you are anticipating, and therefore it will affect your ability to meet your debt service requirements. And therefore, the O&M contract is a critical contract as part of the overall PPP structure. Therefore, when you are structuring your O&M contract, think about the key principles you're trying to achieve. You want to ensure that the infrastructure is operated in accordance with the terms of your offtake and finance agreements. You want to minimize deterioration, wear and tear. You want to ensure that you're complying with your obligations under law. You want to ensure that your assets are not depreciating at a greater level than you anticipated. You want to ensure that you are not incurring more costs than you anticipated in relation to repair and maintenance. Those are some of the key parameters you factor into when you think about your commercial and legal considerations for an O&M agreement. The other issue is you need to understand, how does your O&M agreement work with your other contracts? I've already explained the need to ensure that your operation and maintenance contracts works hand in hand with your offtake agreement and works hand in hand with your finance agreements. But during the operation phase of the project, you may have more than just an operation and maintenance contract. You may have a spare part supply agreement that is not sometimes covered within your O&M contract, and you need a separate spare part supplier for supplying you spare parts for what we call routine maintenance or planned maintenance, or also what we call unplanned maintenance. And therefore, how does your spare parts agreement work with the operation and maintenance agreements? You might have very specialized technical services agreement from specialist providers of services, especially where you have complex infrastructure. You may have to have some of these specialist contracts that work hand in hand with your O&M agreement. And how you manage the interface between these contracts is fundamental to ensure that you can operate your infrastructure within the parameters of your overall project agreements. An operation and maintenance contract will need to consider pricing arrangements. How do you pay your operator to manage your project for a fairly long period of time? There are a number of pricing models you can consider. There are obviously fixed price contracts, but once again, you would expect an operator to be concerned with being able to fix a price on day one to operate an infrastructure, for example, for the next 10 years. How do you provide a fixed price contract where commodity prices are changing regularly? Prices of goods and spare parts could change. Price of labor could change over the long term. And therefore, you will typically end up with hybrid solutions around how you price your O&M. There are certain elements you will fix. There are certain elements, whilst you may fix, may be subject to indexation, for example, based on inflation. And frankly, there are certain elements you may struggle to fix. For example, dealing with costs related to unplanned maintenance. These are the commercial discussions we would expect a sponsor to have with an operator. It is not unusual for lenders to require a fairly long-term O&M agreement. And typically, a lender will want to ensure that the operator is fixed and his prices are fixed for the duration of the debt. And on infrastructure projects, as you would know, you typically have fairly long-term tenors of debt running from 8 to 15 years. So at the very least, a lender may require for the O&M agreement to be fixed to the tenor of the debt. It is highly unlikely that you would fix the term of an O&M agreement to the entire term of a project, which could be 20 or 25 years. But it is likely for a requirement that you fix the term within the debt service period, or at the very least during what I would call the more critical time periods of the debt service period. And therefore, how you factor in all these issues around maintaining the infrastructure, complying with law during the term of your project, complying with your finance agreements, complying with your project agreements and your offtake agreements, is fundamental to understand how these different components impact your O&M agreement. And therefore, this tends to be a highly complex process of being able to map the various risks that need to be dealt with under what is a fairly long-term arrangement. With that, I'd like to come to an end to my presentation in relation to construction contracts and operation and maintenance contracts. Like I've said, I think we have barely scratched the surface in relation to these key contracts that are required in relation to an overall infrastructure or PPP project. But I'm hoping we have been able to deal with some of the key issues from a legal, from a risk perspective, from a commercial perspective, that you would need to consider. And I therefore hope this has been useful to all of you. I thank all of you for joining this webinar. I understand that during the discussions, a number of questions have come through, which I am just receiving. So I will go through some of these questions and hopefully provide you a response. The first question I have is in relation to split EPC contracts. And I think the viewer wanted to get an understanding of how this works. So it's not unusual that for a number of reasons, whether these are legal restrictions in relation to local content requirements, because of tax issues, that an overall construction contract gets split between most likely two elements, an offshore element and an onshore element. Obviously, to carry out construction projects, especially in this region, there is most likely going to be an offshore element and an onshore element. And therefore, if you need to have two separate contracts to deal with this, for whatever reasons, like I said, whether it's regulatory reasons where, for example, in certain jurisdictions, certain types of work onshore can only be carried out by onshore registered contractors. So if you are purchasing equipment from an offshore contractor that is not registered to do onshore works, it could be one of the reasons you need to have two separate contracts. There are sometimes tax reasons where it makes sense to split the offshore works and the onshore works. This is a fairly complicated process to be able to manage, where you move from a single EPC contract into two contracts split, and obviously ensuring the interface between the two contracts, that interface works, is extremely critical. And so it's not unusual that in addition to having an offshore contract and an onshore contract, you structure an umbrella coordination agreement to make sure that these two contracts talk to each other in a way that does not create additional risk for the employer as a result of splitting the contract. Like I said, this is a highly complex legal and commercial and technical process, but I hope these couple of minutes gives you a flavor of what we mean by splitting EPC contracts. The other question we have is in relation to making payments to a contractor in relation to mobilization. And I assume this question relates to advance payments and therefore how you structure them. It is highly unlikely that you will be able to structure a contract, a construction contract with the contractor whereby you can get away without making an advance payment. It is very likely that the contractor will require the advance payment for mobilization, for taking on certain liabilities as a contractor by signing on obligations with other third parties, whether they are suppliers of goods, whether they are subcontractors, who in turn will require, for example, mobilization payments from the main contractor. And therefore, it is very likely that you would be required to make advance payments. However, especially we have seen in relation to construction contracts entered into by government with contractors to build infrastructure projects directly for the government, we have frankly seen horror stories where contractors have taken the advance payment and not started any work, or in the interim period, for other reasons, they have faced financial difficulties and therefore are unable to progress with the project. In some cases, you have seen contractors being declared insolvent just after they have taken on the obligation to build a certain project and receive an advance payment. The key issue to this is if you're making an advance payment, and it's perfectly okay to do so, you have a corresponding advance payment guarantee, which is in the nature of a bank guarantee that is irrevocable, unconditional, payable on demand. So if you have an advance payment guarantee stapled onto an advance payment obligation, then it's perfectly fine to be able to accept the requirement to make an advance payment. I've been told that I am now about to go over the time limit I had set for this discussion. And once again, I'd like to thank all of you. For those of you who had additional questions, please feel free to send us those questions over email. For those of you who want to know if the slides will be made available, they will be made available. And I also understand that this very presentation will also be made available through our A&K website and necessary web pages, and through our ALN Academy. So for those of you who might have missed some sections of the discussion today, the entire presentation will become available in the future, in the very near future, and certainly slides will be made available. And like I said, if you have questions that you'd like us to answer, please feel free to reach out to us. And also not to forget that this is session 4 of our training program on public-private partnerships. We still have a number of other sessions coming up in the coming weeks, dealing with finance documents, land issues, tax issues. So we look forward to joining you again in the near future for those further discussions. And we hope you find this useful. And we hope we continue this conversation with all of you. Thank you very much.